36. All told, about 100 floats and balloons and several thousand performers would snake their way around the city over the course of the next 3 hours or so. More than 1 million people had crowded around the parade route the previous year. Maybe twice that many had been expected this year. The city, and its reputation among tourists, was growing exponentially. If you took a trip to Tabula Rasa, everyone knew it was guaranteed you'd come back with a story to tell. There was no tourism board to advertise the fact. Blink did the advertising for them. Over the summer, Zoey had been crushed to find out that her company would not in fact have a float in the Black Parade. Attending the event sounded like hell, but designing a truly mischievous float sounded like a blast. It turned out the parade organizers had banned Arthur Livingston from the event 3 years ago, after he'd rigged his float with an enormous catapult to fling whimsical projectiles at, and in some cases destroy, other floats along the route. The best Zoey's team had been able to do was convince the organizers to allow her back in next year, if all went well. It wouldn't be a minor project. The average float in the Tabula Rasa Devil's Night Black Parade was wide enough to occupy the entire street, and as tall as many of the buildings it would pass. There was bitter competition between float makers, creative teams sponsored by local businesses and plutocrats, and they kept trying to top each other. Zoey was told that last year, one float was around 200 feet tall, a massive mechanical Grim Reaper that seemed to float along the route. In its bony fist was a headless corpse dressed as a police officer, referencing a real event that had happened months earlier when a policeman was beheaded and hung from an overpass. That incident and its aftermath, including the revelation that higher-ups had been bribed to destroy evidence, had caused hundreds of officers to walk off the job, their positions never to be filled. That was how the Black Parade worked. The floats depicted in graphic, often cartoonishly exaggerated detail, some horror from the dark underbelly of the city. A chance, organizers had always said, for Tabula Rasa to confront and exorcise its demons. And now, apparently, Zoey's mother was a participant. Somehow. Echo was saying, VOP ground units have now been dispersed along the parade route. Every outgoing surface street is being monitored. Zoey only half heard her. If she was still the type to become hysterical about her mother's safety, which she of course wasn't because she had resolved not to be, but if she was, she'd easily be able to put together a nightmare scenario in her mind. Chob's thugs would have known Zoey's mother would be at the parade, would have been watching her, would be ready at a moment's notice to snatch her if they decided they needed leverage. Once they had done that, one of the creative, sadistic minds in Chob's employ could have their way with her, and displayed her body in one of the horror-themed floats. Will, once again seemingly reading her thoughts, said, By far the most likely scenario is that Chob's people picked up your mother and tossed her phone onto one of the passing floats, just so we'd have to chase it down, while they moved her to another location. Andre said, Isn't it just as likely that some dude up on one of the floats spotted her in the crowd and invited her up there? They do that all the time. She's probably giggling and dancing with a guy in a Will costume. We just need to find a feed with the float in view, said Echo. Here. Well... Zoey leaned over. What? It was a drone's view of the parade, tracking a particular float that it turned out was actually very easy to spot. The float in question was a huge ball of flame, 15 stories at least. The flames didn't look holographic. Zoey wasn't sure how they'd achieve the effect without the thing actually being on fire. It's supposed to represent the Goldstone fire. The float is about 4 blocks that way. She pointed. Can already see the glow. Look. Zoey started to picture her mother tied to that float, burning to death. She squished the thought before it could fully form. No, she wasn't doing this. Fear was interest paid on money you didn't even owe. She tried to remember where she'd heard that. Oh, right. It was on a framed poster Arthur had kept in the conference room. She'd thrown it away when they redecorated. Zoey heard a text chime on her phone. She held her breath and looked. Hovering above the screen was a message from her mother, or rather from her mother's phone. 2 words. Come alone. Zoey held up the phone, but didn't say a word. Will barely skipped a beat. All right, we've always known this was a possibility. Here's where we wish we had Marty to use as a trading ship, but... Shut up, Will. Zoey, we've been through this situation before. This is a move we knew was out there for Chob to make. He's made it. Now we make ours. This is exactly what you asked me to prepare for. You think you're some kind of expert at reading people? But I'm telling you, buddy, you are not reading me right now. Zoey looked out of the one-way glass bubble at the crowd, all the giggling people, the dumb costumes. She tried to think of the last time she went somewhere and just enjoyed herself, drinking with real friends who made her laugh until she couldn't breathe. She couldn't even remember. She met Will's impatient eyes and said, "I've got to say, it's a miraculous system you've built here. At one end, you have an unthinkable act of evil. Then the guilt for it gets chopped up and dispersed so that it comes out the other end as a cool breeze." It was only now that Zoey recalled she had been holding this entire heated discussion while wearing the stupid Bonnie the Bonobo monkey mask. She pulled it off and blew hair out of her face. She said, "Everyone, get yourself to safety. Wu, you too." Zoey pulled up her phone and typed a response to the text. "I'll be there." Echo said, "You're not going alone. I don't care what you say. We stop? I'm getting off too." "Why? Because you care about me? If you do, then listen. You people remind me to listen to you 10 times a day. Are you capable of doing it? Any of you? I have to do this because this is what Arthur would never have done. I'm going down there alone, and I'm ordering you to use that distraction to get yourselves to safety. Take this cat with you. Wu, you're relieved of duty. If I survive, I'll leave you a good review." Zoey reached inside her costume, found a band in her pants pocket, and tied back her hair. "Now, does somebody have a weapon I can borrow?" Echo said, "I have something better." 37. Zoey couldn't help but notice that their operation was getting less sophisticated by the minute. A mission that began with an invisible helicopter, a giant robot, and Hollywood-quality wound makeup ended with Zoey alone, on foot, in a smelly rented costume of a bikini-wearing monkey. She was pushing through the crowd along the sidewalk, heading back toward the oncoming parade, occasionally glancing up at the lights of at least 2 helicopters that were circling up there. She was using her phone to track the location of her mother's, and it was, in fact, still creeping toward her at parade speed. Zoey reached the first float a few minutes later, out of breath and sweating in her stupid costume. She kept moving, largely ignoring the parade as it passed. She was vaguely aware of the crowd hooting and whistling when a particularly bawdy float or balloon went by, or groaning and jeering at one built around some intentionally terrible joke or bad pun. She heard everyone burst out laughing at one point and looked up to see a rolling 50-foot-tall animatronic statue of the president sporting a grossly exaggerated stainless steel penis. There had been a rumor that he'd come to Tabula Rasa to get an implant to combat erectile dysfunction. Behind and above him was one of the massive balloons, this one shaped like a crashing airliner, rigged to belch real black smoke behind it and to broadcast the screams of doomed passengers inside. The next float was a platform of actors on a set made up to look like a restaurant kitchen, one man in a bloody chef's costume feeding a pile of stuffed dogs into a sausage grinder, each crank of the wheels spurting quote-unquote blood out into the crowd as it passed. Zoey had no idea what scandal that was referencing. You couldn't stay on top of them all. The pulses of firelight were now just a couple of blocks down, and it absolutely appeared to be an office building fully engulfed in roiling flames, somehow crawling down the street with the rest of the parade. Already, Zoey could hear faint roars from the crowd when it passed. It was a stunning sight, and gave the impression that a strong breeze would cause the whole rolling inferno to tip over onto the crowd. A really good parade, Zoey thought, is one that can accidentally kill you at any moment. She jogged a little faster. It was a cool night, but the costume was stifling, her hot breath steaming her head inside the mask. No horror scenarios of what she would find ahead flashed through her mind. She was too exhausted for that. Plus, it would trigger all sorts of related thoughts she was not equipped to process right now, like the fact that she had spent hours tracking down a lost cat who wasn't even missing, while her actual mother may have been the one who was— Nope. Enough of that. Until she knew what happened, nothing had happened. She had to be ready for whatever, or whoever, was waiting up there. She could hear guitar music overhead now. A live band was playing on a stage 30 feet above the street, the platform held aloft by cables and balloons overhead. People in the crowd were throwing bottles at them as they passed, trying to knock them off. And now, here was the burning float that contained her mother, or her mother's phone, or something. The flames were definitely real. Zoey could feel the heat from where she was on the sidewalk. It was, as Echo had said, commemorating/mocking the infamous Goldstone building fire. That had been an office building in town holding several brokerage firms and other such businesses. When the blaze started, the alarm system and sprinklers both failed, or had never worked at all. 26 people died, supposedly because the staff of one firm feared their boss so much that they stayed rooted at their desks even as smoke slowly filled the room. That boss had apparently told them they would all lose their jobs unless a certain report was finished by the end of the business day, and without an alarm to give the order to evacuate, they just kept working. That was the story, anyway. The boss, who very much evacuated at the first sign of smoke, refused to speak of it in public. The rolling recreation of the building had no exterior walls, so that the burning victims inside were in full view. On each floor of the float were 2 rows of cubicles, each cubicle featuring a life-sized figurine in a suit and tie working away at a computer. Everything was in flames. The desks, the chairs, the workers themselves. Fire rippled over their bodies, licking across faces that remained obliviously locked in concentration over some spreadsheet or other. Zoey figured they had to be extremely detailed animatronic dummies, ones designed so that the flesh would still cook and peel in an incredibly realistic manner. Zoey studied the burning office inhabitants to see if there was anything that stood out. Not to see if any of them were her mother, of course, like if they had strapped her to a chair alongside the flammable dummies and set her on fire, her skin turning black while she screamed and the crowd cheered, because Zoey was past that, past imagining terrible things happening to her loved ones. The tracking implied the phone was close, somewhere around the first level of the float. For all she knew, the phone was just lying up there, slowly getting melted. She needed a closer look, somehow. Well, the costume covered every inch of her body. It'd protect her enough to get up close, right? For just a few seconds? Long enough to see if any of the roasting human figures were... Part of Zoe's brain was still trying to run the numbers in that plan, while another part was already making her feet go. That damned hand cream. She climbed over the barrier that had been set up along the sidewalk, then ran around to the front of the float and jumped onto its bumper. She had some idea that because these were decorative special effects pyrotechnics, that they somehow wouldn't be quite as hot as the flames you'd get in, say, an actual office fire. She now wasn't sure that was the case, absolutely feeling like she was being cooked alive in her ridiculous costume. She could faintly hear people yelling and gasping from the crowd. To them, this float had just gotten about 50% more entertaining. Look, everyone, a drunk person could die. In front of her, the 2 rows of flaming cubicles on the first floor were separated by a walkway, just as they would be in an actual office. There was a gap in the flames wide enough for a person to dash through if they were wearing good protective gear or were very stupid. She squinted against the flames and tried to study the burning figures to see if any of them were not animatronic. The ones nearest seemed to be performing the same looping mechanical movements, their flaming hands comically tapping keyboards and shuffling burning papers, everything made of some kind of material that was never fully consumed by the blaze. She couldn't see much beyond those first couple. She heard someone shouting commands from the street behind her, a lone VOP security guard, jogging her way, not because she was an organized crime queen with a bounty on her head, but because she was presumably a drunk idiot in a monkey costume climbing on a giant rolling inferno. She heard a few hip people in the crowd yelling, "Bonnie, where's Raja?" The guard reached out for Zoe's leg, and she pulled herself into the fire. The air was instantly sucked from her lungs. Heat squeezed around her like a fist. What was she doing? She tried to shield her face with her arm. She ran forward, between the cubicles. The crowd was going insane, cheering like they were watching a daredevil jump a ravine in a motorcycle. Zoey tried to get a good look at each burning figure as she passed, but the flames lashed out at her, flashing into her eyes, cooking her skin, whooshing and roaring around her like snarling demons. This was stupid. So stupid. She rushed past the cubicles, sure these were just mannequins. This was all a stupid trap and she'd fallen for it. She reached the rear end of the float and jumped off, quickly trying to look around at herself to see if the costume was on fire. It was. She felt it. Zoey had to pull the zipper down the back. There were flames back there, and she badly scorched her hand, even through the furry gloves. She was only able to yank the zipper down about halfway, but it was enough to get her shoulders out and shove the smoking suit of fur down to her feet. She still had the mask on, so she was now just a woman in jeans, a sweat-matted "how about I slap your shit" t-shirt, and a smoldering monkey head. Would the cameras detect her identity judging from the neck down? They probably could map out her arm's cellulite or something. Who cares at this point? The fiery float had pulled away from her, and Zoey turned to see the back of it to take one last look. There was a sign on the rear position so it would flash to the crowd as a punchline, and in burning text it said, "Proudly maintained by Ash Construction." Zoey froze. That wasn't right, was it? It's not like parade floats are held to some kind of journalistic standards. Someone would have told her if that building had been her father's, that he was possibly to blame for its failing fire protection system, and that, by extension, she was to blame for not fixing it. While she stared, Zoey was swallowed up by a flock of dancers and a rapper who was freestyling insults to random people he found in the crowd. Zoey tried to step out of their way, then pulled out her phone and looked at the tracking info for her mother again. It no longer showed she was in the fire float. She, or the phone, was ahead of Zoey now, moving down the parade. They were toying with her. She knew. She considered going back, finding the suits, calling it all off. Then the VOP guy came around the fire float, yelling commands at her. Zoey ran through the dancers, vaguely aware that the rapper was now also berating her. "Get out the parade, Bonnie. You gon' get run over for real. These floats don't float, bitch. That shit's on wheels. Also, can we get a round of applause for Bonnie's titties?" Zoey looked back at her pursuer in time to see the yellow jacket get accidentally tripped by one of the dancers, who did an impressive job of managing to make it look like part of the choreography. Zoey ran, making her way back down the parade, having seen no sign whatsoever of her mother or her mother's phone or anything else. She ran around the next float. A quick glance to the side revealed it to be several actors in yellow VOP jackets comically brutalizing a young man who had stolen a loaf of bread, the victim on the ground yelling, "I told y'all I paid for it! I got the receipt right here! Ah!" Then she was moving through a group of marchers in Rasta costumes. Or actual Rastas. One or the other. There were several huge Jamaican flags, and they were towing the cables of a balloon shaped like an enormous joint, a mechanism spraying smoke down at the crowd from the lit end. If it wasn't weed smoke, it sure as hell smelled like it. Her phone showed her target was still up ahead. Somewhere. Zoey passed some clowns who were tossing out little bags of pills like they were candy. Then a group of strippers wearing little girl dresses and holding oversized lollipops. Zoey tried not to think about that and jumped onto the front of the next float, her phone insisting her target was right there with her. Zoey saw the scene they had staged and sucked in a breath. On one hand, this float seemed like it had been hastily put together, lacking the production value of the others. Many of the floats were the result of professional teams working sometimes years in advance, but this one featured only a clean white, quote-unquote, room, a floor and a few pieces of furniture, and in the middle was a banquet table. Lying on it was a man who was vaguely intended to look like Dexter Tilly. Same buzz cut, same crudely applied acne, drawn-on stitches in the appropriate spots. On his abdomen were piled loops of sausage and other meat parts they had thrown on to suggest he'd been gutted, fake blood splattered over everything, running off the sides of the table and onto the floor. The man playing Tilly screamed for help, improvising lines about how he was being eaten, begging for death. At the head of the table, sitting in front of a plate full of bloody guts, shirt and face smeared with red, was a person in a costume who was clearly supposed to be Titus Chaub. Wasn't like it was hard to get the costume together. All the guy had to do was shave the sides of his head, add some gray hair coloring, and put on a wrinkled work shirt and khakis. The fake Chaub stood up from his seat and turned to show the crowd a comically exaggerated erection in his pants. He shouted, "Look, I'm getting my youth back already!" That's how quickly Bud's rumor had spread. This float would have already been in the staging area when the talk began to radiate outward from Bud's contacts. The ambitious designers of this one apparently tore down the original idea they'd worked on for who knows how long, and threw together this scene with what they could get their hands on at the last minute, figuring that being on the cutting edge of a scandal would trump production value. From the reaction of the crowd, stunned into silence, with only the drunkest of them daring to laugh, they'd done it. They'd managed to actually cross a boundary. The only other player on the set was a muscular guy they'd found to play Dirk Vikernes, who stood humorlessly behind Chaub, staring Zoey down. They hadn't been able to find the armor. He was just in a tank top and black leather pants with a ridiculous glowing yellow codpiece. But they at least did get the stupid snake beard right. They'd even added an eye patch, as apparently word of him having died via scissors to the skull had hit the streets. Zoey glanced down at her phone and saw her mother's signal crawl her way at the same moment the eye-patched muscle man was walking toward her, reaching out, grabbing her. The guy on the table lifted his head and said, "Hey, that's Dirk Vikernes." By the time Zoey realized the same, she was flying through the air. 38. Zoey blinked. She had lost consciousness. She found herself lying in a pile of something somewhat soft but scratchy, and for the moment couldn't recall how she had got there. She was staring up at the stars, the sounds of a parade all around her. She was in unbelievable pain. Ah, now she remembered. Dirk Vikernes, who it turned out was absolutely alive, had grabbed her by the neck, picked her up, and thrown her like it was an Olympic event. Zoey sat up on her elbows and found she was sitting in a huge pile of fake money. She had landed on the next float down from the child cannibalism scene. If she'd missed and landed on the pavement, she'd likely have split her head open. She didn't know if this meant Vikernes had failed or succeeded with his throw. She sat up fully and realized that, in fact, she had landed just seconds ago. Everyone nearby was staring, trying to comprehend what in the hell had just happened. She made eye contact with a mostly naked Asian woman and said, "Hi." Zoey tried to get to her feet in the waist-deep cash pool and immediately stumbled. She didn't seem to have use of her left arm or right leg, and the back of her neck was wet with what she was pretty sure was blood. She baited off of the edge, or something, when she landed. The bonobo mask had fallen off at some point. She heard a commotion from street level and knew that Vikernes was coming, would hop up here with her within seconds. She trudged through the drifts of fake money and looked back, for the first time registering the float she was on. It was decorated to be an amazingly lavish bathroom, more ostentatious than anything in her estate, or anything she'd ever install there. Zoey had landed in a giant golden hot tub that could probably accommodate 20 people, full of bundled cash instead of water. Across from Zoey was a naked animatronic sex doll with a Zoey ash black and blue wig. It was mechanically grabbing handfuls of the cash and washing with it, rubbing it around its chest and neck. Standing around the tub were 4 female slaves, all in filthy rags that barely covered their privates, and ankle and neck shackles. They were actual women, and they had been fanning Zoey and acting like they were feeding her grapes. She didn't need the backstory explained for this one. She suspected the parade spectators didn't either. Arthur Livingston, Zoey's father, had for years trafficked women from all over the world. He gave them safe passage to the USA in exchange for their services, sex work jobs they agreed to only in the sense that the alternative was starving in a refugee camp back home. Many of these women were still in Zoey's employ, because when Zoey had demanded they be freed, Will carefully explained that these women were not prisoners, that they had no other skills, and would simply be snapped up by one of the city's other brothels, or worse, street pimps. Their new bosses would likely be men, likely be less generous with the pay, likely make less effort to keep them safe. They had nowhere else to go. Zoey had told Will that she'd only agree on the condition that they were given time and money to get trained in something else, to do sales or coding or something. He'd explained that they had already had those programs, that Arthur had said the same toward the end of his life, but few took advantage due to language barriers, or the burden of child care, or just not seeing the point in training for something that ultimately would pay less money. Words on top of words, the mortar keeping the bricks of the status quo locked into place. And eventually, Zoey just dropped the issue, the same as her father had. She yelled at the 4 slave girls, who were presumably just local actresses or models, "Run! Get off the float!" Zoey tried to do this herself, but there was Dirk Vikernes now, climbing onto the float with them. The girls just stared. Zoey saw his bare shoulders, and there were the surgery scars. When he was rushed away to get help for a stabbed eyeball, he'd apparently decided to get an upgrade while he was in the shop. Zoey grabbed her necklace and said, "Stop!" He did not stop. Somehow, she knew he wouldn't. Still, she tried a string of similar words. No effect. The giant man stepped forward, and then, projecting his voice for the crowd, said to Zoey, "When you die, this city will throw a party, and I think you know it. Is my mother safe?" He ignored this question, as Zoey had suspected he would. She was still standing in the tub of money, and actually wasn't totally sure she could lift her dead leg up over the lip. She was trying to stand in a way that would not reveal to him that at least 2 of her limbs now didn't work. "As you can see," he said, in a tone that suggested a rehearsed line, "I have come back from the grave stronger than before. When you see your father, thank him for bringing his invention into the world." Dirk Vikernes lifted up his eye patch, and Zoey was sure that what she would find there was some kind of laser or plasma pulse thing embedded in the eye socket, something that would fire a beam and incinerate her. "Go! Get off here!" she yelled at the 4 servant girls. This time they listened, though they still didn't seem to grasp the severity of the situation. Everyone seemed to suspect this might still be part of the performance. They pulled free of their prop manacles and jumped ship. Zoey tried to climb over the lip of the tub, struggling to lift her uncooperative leg. She found herself staring at the rows of spectators as they passed. To the tourists, this all must have looked like some kind of highly experimental theater. Dirk Vikernes put his hands on his hips, and Zoey tried to prepare herself to dive away from whatever flashed out of the man's replacement eye. Instead, his yellow codpiece opened. Out from it flew a length of thin chain, which ended in a wicked bloom of sharp spikes. The chain curled up into the air like a whip, and then whooshed down in a blur, making impact right in the center of the tub. There was a crash of blue energy, and a shock wave that split the float in half, spraying a cloud of fake money and animatronic Zoey limbs in every direction. Zoey tumbled over the lip of the tub, then fell off of the float entirely. The float itself skidded to a stop, the axles shattered from the impact of Dirk Vikernes' electrified crotch whip. The crowd went wild, now certain this was part of the act. This kind of thing didn't actually happen to people, right? Zoey landed hard on the pavement and struggled to suck in air. The wind had been knocked out of her. She tried to get up and found she could not. Her limbs physically wouldn't respond to her commands. But also, she just couldn't. There was no energy inside her. Battery discharge error. She lay there, looking up at the sky. Someone in the crowd said, "Hey, I think that's her." Oh, well, it wasn't really a stealth mission anymore. Or any kind of mission. "Yep, it's me," she muttered to herself. "Are you enjoying the parade?" She knew Vikernes was coming. She knew he could splatter her like a beetle. And still she lay there, listening to the rumbling crowd, staring up at the stars, funny money wafting down like a ticker tape parade. And in that moment, she gave up. 39. The giant man with his absurd snake beard came into view. Apparently, the cod piece was not made to actually retract the crotch whip after use, as the chain was now dragging uselessly behind him, scraping along the pavement as he walked. He loomed over Zoey and said, "They're not coming, by the way. Your people? If you're expecting them to show up at the last minute, you should know they're being pursued in the other direction." "Sure. Hey, I'm not gonna lie. I can't stand up." He kneeled down over her, like a statue that has been toppled. "Dude, I just want to know if my mother's okay." He drew a knife. "The challenge of our age," he said, "is pulling the lost generation of men out of the fake wars you've given them to fight and convincing them to fight the real ones. You know they're still celebrating killing your avatar? We will wake them up, one at a time. We are the children you sacrificed to your god, come back to have our vengeance." "I want you to know that while you're making this speech, all I'm hearing is a series of fart noises coming out of your mouth." He smirked and wrapped a rough hand around Zoey's chin, holding her head still. He brought the knife down and said, "First, an eye for an eye." When Zoey realized what he meant to do, the fight-or-flight mechanism in her brain finally kicked in, and she found enough strength to get her hands up, to try to push him away, to grab at his face. Even without implants, he could have overpowered her without straining himself. Her thrashing around only added to his amusement. A blade was moving steadily toward her right eye. Then there was a sickening thud, and Dirk Vikernes' head bounced forward. He just stared for a brief moment. Then blood dripped down onto Zoey's face. He reached back and felt his head, pulled away red fingers. Another thud. Then he slumped over on top of her. His body was twitching. Someone was rolling the huge man off of her now. It was a very large, very drunk-looking woman, probably in her 50s. Zoey didn't recognize her costume. She was dressed in a tank top and suspenders with filthy jeans, a bandana around her neck. She had a sledgehammer in each hand. They were apparently not plastic props, as one was now matted with blood and hair. She nudged Dirk Vikernes with her foot and said, "Did I kill him?" She then looked at Zoey. "What's going on here?" Other people were crowding around now. They didn't seem to know what was happening either. She heard one of them mutter her name. Zoey said, "Get away from him!" She scooted away from Vikernes, pushing backward on the pavement with one working leg. He groaned and got up on hands and knees, blood streaking down his face. Grunting, growling, he raised a hand toward her. Zoey thought he was going to get up and grab a utility pole and smash her like he was swatting a fly, or unleash a bolt of lightning from his fist. Instead, he hissed to the crowd around him, "You idiots! That is Zoey Ash!" He climbed to his feet and snatched his knife off the pavement, the blood running crimson zebra stripes across his face. He took a step toward Zoey. He was tackled from behind, the woman with the hammers. He dropped the blade, and another woman ran in and grabbed it. "I've got his knife!" Vikernes stood upright, the huge woman now clinging to him, the bloody man wearing her like a backpack. "Get off me!" Someone from the crowd flew in and dove at his knees. Dirk went down. Someone else tried to get him in a headlock. People swarming in, strangers in costumes trying to tackle the huge man like a fullback. Vikernes snarled and flung everyone aside. One went flying, slamming into a storefront wall and going limp. This only inflamed the crowd. They closed in again, screaming curses at the enraged, bloody man. The big woman found one of her costume hammers on the sidewalk and smacked Dirk Vikernes in the back, and he fell to his hands and knees once more. Then, the woman who'd picked up the knife came running up, shouting, "He's got those implant things! I know how to disable it!" She started wildly stabbing Dirk Vikernes in the ass. This did not dislodge the rating capacitor, but it definitely got the man's attention. He spun on the woman and snatched her throat. The big woman with the hammer stepped up, screamed, and swung. The impact of the hammer on Dirk Vikernes' skull was a sound Zoey was pretty sure she would never forget. The huge man flopped to the ground like a sack of meat. Then the woman screamed and hit him again. And again. Finally, she stood over him, huge chest heaving. The gang who'd felled the giant gathered around, stunned at the turn their night had taken. The big woman said, "Now is he dead? If not, I'll hit him with something bigger." She turned to Zoey, who'd never gotten up off the sidewalk. "You all right, dear?" "Yeah." "You know this turd?" "Sort of. This is Titus Job's right-hand man." "I don't know who that is." "Rich guy? Employs a lot of people with guns. He was the guy on the float back there. It doesn't matter." Others were tending to the person who'd gotten flung into the wall. A young guy, who was sitting up but with a blank expression. A girl yelled for an ambulance. Work crews were rapidly trying to figure out how to get the shattered float out of the way so the parade could continue. Nothing stops the party in Tabula Rasa. The large woman, who Zoey decided was probably not a medical professional by day because she didn't seem to know the rule for not moving injured people, yanked Zoey to her feet like she was riding a knocked-over garden gnome. Zoey held on for support for a moment, but found she could stand. Sort of. Her left arm still didn't work. Several women, friends of the hammer lady, were trying to talk to her. "Are you okay? Oh my god, is that guy dead? Jenny, look at his scars. Are you okay? You got blood on the back of your shirt. Did you hit your head? I think there's an ambulance coming. Are you Yeah, I'm okay, I think. Who are you people?" "I'm Danny," said one of them. "That's Jenny, that's Shonda." The last one was the hammer lady. "Hi, you're Zoey, obviously," a bystander said. "Who?" Shonda said, "Oh, she's the one who got them to run the buses out to my trailer park. She's the only reason I can work in the city. And if you've ever used one of them free clinics, you thank this girl right here." "Oh, thank you," said Zoey. "All that was the very least we could do." Zoey looked around, nervously. Her life had been saved because she had apparently gotten attacked in front of the only handful of people in this city who actually liked her. "In fact," Zoey said, I need to get out of here before the less friendly people in the crowd find me." On cue, Zoey heard someone pushing through the gathering behind her. She turned and braced herself, very aware that even a small child could knock her over in her current state. Several teenage girls popped out. They were bouncing with excitement. Zoey, oh my god! We watched it all! Are you okay? Can we get a picture real quick?" On one hand, this seemed like a less lethal threat than she was anticipating. On the other, she was having primal high school flashbacks. The girl who was asking was wearing tights with cat ears and a tail. Zoey got a homecoming queen vibe from her and wondered who exactly she wanted to show the picture to. Zoey said, "Do what you want, but I'm not going to do anything to entertain you. The blood on my face isn't mine, if that's what you were hoping for." The girl's face fell. Oh God, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to be rude. I'm a fan. If this is a bad time, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say thank you." "Oh, No, don't be sorry. I just got attacked by a guy who launched a thing from his crotch. I assumed you're being sarcastic. I don't think I have fans. Seriously? You went in and talked down that guy who was holding that girl hostage. I named my cat Zoey. Another of the teens, this one dressed as a nurse, who was about to get fired for violating the dress code, said, "You want a drink? There's the vendor right over there." "No, I've got a thing. I have to, meet my mom somewhere, hopefully." "Oh, you guys are already taking the picture. Should I wipe off my face?" "Nah, the blood is badass. Smile." The cat girl and the inappropriate nurse squeezed on either side of her, and a pink buzzing gadfly dropped in and snapped the pic of all three. A third woman, dressed as a futuristic schoolgirl in a glowing pink wig, who Zoey eventually noticed was dressed as Naoko from My Hero Reo, said, "Can I have a hug, or is that weird?" And so, Zoey hugged her, and then she was hugging everyone, and the whole time she could hear people nearby talking about what to do with the apparently dead guy whose brain was splattered all over the pavement. The destroyed Zoey bath float was now being dragged slowly down the street by a pair of trucks, someone having decided to just make the shattered wreckage part of the parade. The crowd gasped as a gigantic Cthulhu balloon passed overhead, the tentacles on its face rigged to reach down and snatch at the crowd as it passed. People shrieked and laughed. Zoey tried to pry herself away from her fans and largely failed. Then, two serious-looking men in suits showed up. Large men, not brandishing weapons because they didn't have to. Behind them was a wall of yellow jackets, a whole swarm. Why hadn't they intervened a moment ago? Maybe they were all hoping Dirk Vikernes' demise would mean a spot had opened up for a promotion. Shonda asked, "Who are these guys?" "It's fine. I was expecting them. Thank you. Really." One of the suited men said, "Miss Ash, we'd like to take you to your mother." "Where is she?" The other man silently pointed up and behind Zoey, to the top of Freya's palace in the distance. Titus Chob's stupid black blimp was parked up there, visible only as an oval void in the stars. "I'll go, but you have to agree not to do anything to these people. They stopped that monster from killing me, that's all. If you want to blame somebody for Dirk's death, other than Dirk himself, then blame me. Mr. Vikernes was not an employee at the time of his demise, and his death is not our jurisdiction. This way. You'll have to help me walk." 40. Zoey wound up in the back of an unmarked sedan. This made for an incredibly awkward, silent car ride with her captors, and, as she always did in such situations, she distracted herself with her phone. She tuned in to Charlie Chopra, who was doing a broadcast from the scene of Dirk Vikernes' crotch assault on the Black Parade and his subsequent death by hammer. He was interviewing Shonda, while in the background, Kowalski was processing Vikernes' huge muscular corpse, now covered with a sheet. Kowalski was carrying a tiny bloody object in a clear plastic evidence bag, presumably the capacitor someone had cut out of Vikernes' body. Still, Zoey stared hard at the corpse, expecting the man to spring to life and start smashing everything into oblivion. She watched intently as they loaded him into the back of an ambulance parked on the sidewalk, his face covered, a limp hand flopping sadly out from under the sheet. In he went, the doors closing behind him. He would soon be put into the ground, and the worms and bugs would not note that he tasted any better or worse than anyone else. Zoey turned off the stream, then recalled the strange request Will had made earlier, that she go back and watch the video from the night of her hostage crisis. She'd had no clue at the time what exactly he wanted her to see, but now she had a suspicion. She browsed through archived feeds from the scene a month ago, looking for shots of the crowd that had gathered to watch the Night In fiasco unfold. She started playback around the moment her leopard print convertible arrived. There was the building with the Godzilla bite taken out. There was the thin yellow line of VOP guards holding back the gawkers. She zoomed in on the crowd. She spotted some of the individual ringleaders they'd called out in their analysis earlier in the day, and in fact found the scruffy kid who led her into the room at the Screw to patch her into the meeting. She wondered if that kid had survived the fire. When her leopard print car pulled up, he and the rest were the first to start mooing and hurling insults. They were right by the spot where she parked the car, where they'd know she'd hear them. Zoey saw herself get out of the car, hear the taunts, and say something about them to Will. Zoey remembered that she'd wanted to push the crowd back, but on the feed, Will was saying something that she'd since forgotten, how he'd wished he could get the hecklers closer to the building. Zoey turned up the audio, scrolled the video along the crowd by hopping across various feeds, watching every face. She counted. There were no more than 20 people actually yelling horrible things at her in that moment. About that many more stood around them, kind of looking spiteful, but not really participating in the rage. Outside of that group, she only found people who weren't necessarily cheering Zoey, but they were smiling, waving, trying to get her attention. A group 5 times the size of the trolls. Once she got to the periphery of the crowd, she saw faces that showed no sign of knowing who Zoey was or why this girl in the table lamp skirt was even relevant to the situation. She accidentally hopped to a feed 2 blocks away and found only oblivious citizens strolling out of shops or ordering food from vending machines, only vaguely aware that there was a commotion over at the Night Inn and that they should probably steer clear. In the end, it had just been that little group of yelling guys. So few you could stuff them all into a single van. That's all it had taken to generate enough noise and ugliness to create the illusion that the entire species was against her. Will had wanted them even closer to Dexter Tilly to reinforce that belief that his people were an overwhelming majority, feeding his illusion of power and Zoey's illusion of powerlessness. Out of curiosity, she switched the focal point of the feed, calling up all of the feeds that had been pointed at her. Zoey's lifelong relationship with cameras was tumultuous and toxic. She could, if she was being honest, take a pretty damned good photo under the right circumstances. Looking upward a little, pushing the chest out, making her eyes big, just enough of a smile so as not to show her jacked up teeth. But seeing her in a candid photo someone else took was like looking into a funhouse mirror, the camera turning her into a cruel mockery of herself. There was the little double chin, the fat rolls, the corpse complexion, the eyeliner that was never ever drawn exactly the same on both eyes. An unlovable troll that would make guys turn off the bedroom lights so they could pretend she was someone else. There, on these feeds, was that woman, only also looking scared to the point that she seemed sickly, fragile. It was horrible to see this version of herself, and her impulse was to shut it off, look away. But she was also beginning to understand. There she was, now recoiling from the wreckage of the spider robot, then steadfastly deciding to head into the building to face the monster that had done that damage. Zoey tried to see herself as the crowd would see her, this lumpy, jiggly thing in a dumb outfit, clumsily clambering up the food truck, then slowly climbing the ladder, wind whipping around her lampshade skirt and throwing her fat polka-dotted butt to the crowd, totally unequipped to face the threat that had smashed its way into the building, but facing it all the same. There was a moment where her left foot slipped on a run. Zoey didn't even remember that happening, and an almost comical gasp went up from the crowd, scared that she would fall. In his careful staging of the scene, Will had turned Zoey into an underdog, someone to root for, an everyday woman just trying to do her best in absurdly awful circumstances. Once Tilly took her out of the room and away from the view of the cameras, the feeds had shifted to Will. He had immediately gone back down that ladder, actually sliding the last few steps, like he'd had tons of ladder practice in his life. He hit the ground already pointing and barking orders, coordinating with Andre and Kowalski. A team of firefighters dragged the food truck away, and, a few minutes later, staff and customers started streaming out of the front entrance to cheers from the crowds. Cameras swarmed in as Will huddled with an armored team of Kowalski's men, chopping the air with one hand to emphasize commands as the men checked their elaborate guns. Before they ran into the building, he swatted one guy on the shoulder pads and said, "Get her the hell out of there." It was a clear narrative, and not totally inaccurate. Zoey sacrificing her own safety to occupy the superpowered psychopath so that her people could rescue the innocents. All of the important, complicating context that might muddle the story, that Zoe's side had inadvertently supplied that psycho with his powers, that she profited from the plight of hostage and captor alike, was conveniently invisible to the cameras. Before she could watch any more, the car rolled to a stop, and her door was opened.